Okay, we're rolling. In chapter 2 of your book, The Fight Against Monsanto's Roundup, what did you mean by better active today than radioactive tomorrow?
Well, that's an old slogan from the anti-nuclear fight when we shut down the Shoreham nuclear power plant, prevented it from opening, and also in the Seabrook anti-nuclear fight in the late 70s and early 80s. That was our slogan because we didn't want to be radioactive. And we knew the nuclear power plants, even though they're supposed to be providing cheap energy and clean energy, it's neither cheap nor clean. And people were fighting on it. And so we were very active, not radioactive.
In chapter 21 of your book, The Fight Against Monsanto's Roundup, what did you mean by respecting the underground ecosystem and gut microbiome?
Well, the gut microbiome turns out to be crucial, and this is all new to me. I learned this from other people, like a lot of the things that I've written. And in our gut are really crucial bacteria, yeah, we knew that, but that are essential for preventing all sorts of diseases. And one of the things that Roundup, Monsanto's Roundup, does, it attacks the bacteria in the gut, which then can lead to all sorts of other ailments and diseases, including, it looks like, autism, and including, all that is not confirmed yet, but it looks, Stephanie Seneff has a material on that, and Jay Feldman from Beyond Pesticides was talking about that also in the book. So all these are absolutely crucial to think of what's in our gut as an ecosystem unto itself. And then we have the larger ecosystem, or the micro, you have the micro ones and then the micro ones. And somehow these many levels, it's very complicated mathematically or scientifically, because we could figure out some of the things within an ecosystem, but how does it relate to the next ecosystem or the larger one that's encompassing it, and the small one going up and down the levels? And then it gets really complicated really quickly. And we're just learning about it.
Is it a good idea to spray New York City or other cities to prevent against West Nile virus and other similar diseases?
Is it a good idea? That's wonderful. No, it's a horrible idea. It started with Mayor Giuliani, who's been in the press lately, again, same as he ever was. It went to Mayor Bloomberg, who's also in the press lately, running for president. Then it now goes to de Blasio, who is still doing the spraying, and he's supposed to be progressive compared to the others, and that's still happening. Now, we used to meet with Mayor de Blasio before he was mayor, when he was city council, and we would meet with all these people, and yet still they insist on spraying to kill mosquitoes that are said to be carrying West Nile virus. That's how I got involved in all this, how we formed the No Spray Coalition against pesticides, and which is www.nospray.org. And when they sprayed New York the first year in '99, we got together and we challenged. First, we didn't know what they were spraying. Then we found it to be malathion. They didn't know what they were spraying for. They didn't know it was West Nile even. They knew it was some mosquito, or they thought it was some mosquito-borne ailment. They originally thought that Saddam Hussein had sent this over as a bioterrorist attack. That was part of what my talk was about earlier today, was looking at the U.S. policy to other countries around the world with how it's conducted here, the spraying and how those intersect. And no, it's a horrible idea. So I'll tell the story about it. I was out in Prospect Park on September 9th, I believe, 1999, and I'm out there, and all of a sudden, and millions of people are out there, great summer day, or actually autumn day, but it was still summer. And there were loads of little kids out there, older people walking their dogs. It was just packed. And then I heard something, I looked up, and there come the helicopters right over the tree line. And I think it was 2 helicopters, if I remember correctly. Maybe it was 1. My remembering of all this stuff is like everything happened really fast. And it comes over and it starts spraying everybody and everything in the park, drowning or drenching everybody. So I realized what it was because I had seen some announcement of that barely on TV like a few days before. And I ran around to try and get the kids and everybody, but mostly the kids, out of the park because the pesticides are just so harmful to children. It's harmful to adults too, but especially to children who are not developed yet, and it could impact them for the rest of their lives. And so we ran, get in. There were police cars there, and the police did nothing. They didn't make any announcement. They didn't warn anybody at that time. It was just, they're just sitting there. And so we ran and tried to get out of the park. And then we eventually filed a lawsuit another few months later against the city with the New York Environmental Law and Justice Project. Joel Kupferman was our lawyer's name. Great person. We went to Stony Brook University together. And we put together this lawsuit that challenged the spraying over water, the spraying of people, just all different aspects of it, where the chemicals were stored. We had a toxicologist, Dr. Robert Simon, who took samples all over the city. In the course of this whole thing, we took samples from the mayor's house at Gracie Mansion. We snuck over the fence and put them in sterile containers. It's just soil samples. And it turned out that almost a year later, the samples still had residues of pesticides in them, even though that was supposed to be gone out of the environment, they said, pretty immediately. The stuff breaks down, they said. Under ideal conditions, they break down pretty quickly, but it turns out there are never ideal conditions. It's always rainy a little bit, or it's sunny. They need exact heavy doses of ultraviolet sunlight to break down. Where you're going to get that in Prospect Park under the trees, and there was all sorts of issues. The chemicals were stored out here on Long Island, out in Cutchogue, I think it was, and so they were kept. We actually had people coming out and tracking them. We thought like we were becoming private eyes in a way, and we saw that they were being stored in these sheds that were being hit by the sun before they were done, and they got really hot in the canisters, which causes the malathion, which is what it was, to break down into isomalathion and maaloxin, which are 10 times, 20 times more dangerous than even the malathion, which is bad enough. There was a component in the malathion called piperonal butoxide, which is also now added to what they replaced the malathion with, which is pyrethroids, which are also dangerous, but in a different way. And this is that alone is a cancer-causing agent, but it prevents the body from breaking down the poison in the body so that it poisons the insect. But it also poisons people, and it poisons animals and fish. And you're not allowed to spray, even on the label it says you're not allowed to spray over or near water or public waterways, because it kills everything in there. So over the year, and 2 years, and then 3 years, and then 4 years that the lawsuit was going on, the courts pulled it apart piece by piece, even though we had people testifying that they were sprayed in the face, that they were in the hospital. The city made no record of people who were poisoned by the pesticide. No record of that by them, so we set up our own hotline so people could call. And we're all a nothing group. We're just a few people who, who were active and knew each other on various issues. And suddenly just everything was going wrong with this, whether the courts were pulling apart the court case. And eventually the last judge just threw everything out, except he said that he'll leave it open, the question about whether or not it was sprayed over or near water, because that was in federal law under the Clean Water Act, which passed surprisingly under Richard Nixon. Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Environmental Protection Agency. There are a whole bunch of environmental things. I talk about a lot about that in the book, about how it is that Richard Nixon, who everybody that I knew hated, like legitimate, including me, but yet all these environmental laws were passed for possibly the wrong reasons under his presidency. And they continue today. And now they're being torn apart today, even that. So then it went up and down the courts, back and forth. It took 7 years. Finally, a federal judge took that little window that we were left open. Didn't matter that people were sprayed in the face. Didn't matter that all these animals died. That we talked to animal rehabilitators, and Bob Zink out in Staten Island had kept detailed logs of every animal that was brought to him after the spraying, and he gave them to us, and we went through them one by one, and we went through all the phone calls that we got. The city's hotline was being answered out in Pennsylvania somewhere with non-union workers, and they just farmed it out, who knew nothing at all. They were just like anybody, just poor people who needed a job, so they get the job. They don't know what they're talking about. They're not trained in anything, and they didn't have any idea what a pesticide was, and you're only supposed to call them if you think you had West Nile, and then they send you somewhere else. They couldn't give you advice on that either. So it went up to one judge, federal judge, Judge Daniels, who ruled that we were right. Finally, in 2006, we got the first ruling. Up until then, the city refused to negotiate with us. We met with them thousands of times. I mean, it was thousands is an exaggeration, but I'd say hundreds of times we met with someone or else someone else in the city. It just went on and on, meeting all these people. It didn't matter. They didn't care. They didn't want to listen to us. And then we went to the next level up. We got all these doctors involved who opposed the spraying. It was quite remarkable. Every single one said that that the spraying was horrible, especially for children and elderly people too. And if you're immune compromised, and if you have other diseases, which is pretty much, I'd say, 3/4 of the people in New York, and it didn't matter. Nobody cared about that. In the courts, nobody in the official capacity cared about it. A lot of other people cared about it in the street and in their houses and in where they were being sprayed. So Judge Daniel ruled that indeed it was sprayed over the water, and that's illegal, and that it was sprayed from a point source. This is how technical, how the Clean Water Act runs, and the city opposed that, and they lost, and we won. And as soon as we won that, all of a sudden, oh, let's negotiate. Yes, maybe you're right. You know, they could have saved all those lives. Literally, people was getting sick all over the place from the spraying. Not as some people got very sick from West Nile. The numbers, though, comparatively were very low, like 7 people in the whole New York area the first year, 4 in New York City. And from the spraying, people, I'd say hundreds of people, maybe more, were sickened by the spray the first 2 years. And it was just awful. And so then the city wants to negotiate with us. So we said, all right. And our tactic in negotiating was not your normal way, because we had met with some of the major environmental groups to come and support us. NRDC, I'll name them. Environmental Defense Fund was the other big one. 2 giant nonprofit corporate environmental groups that we all get fundraising letters from. They didn't want to help us one bit early on. They just said, no, we're not getting involved in that. Why? I don't know. They couldn't put the issues together and didn't want to, and they were afraid that we were going to be too radical and they couldn't control what we were saying. Not that we said anything that outrageous, but yeah, it was pretty radical, saying they shouldn't be spraying pesticides at all. And that was a debate. Well, what about a little bit? What about here? What about this? So when we won in court on the first level, then the judge ruled. Then the city began negotiating with us, and there was a changeover in the administration of the city. And one of the neat things that happened when the administration changed over is that the new people in charge of the Department of Health, and they wanted to get back at the people who came before them and to make it seem that they really were not going to be the same. So they just spilled like all this information about it. In a way, it's like the Monsanto papers today, which is a lot more detailed and a lot more horrible. But they just told us they would come to meetings and talk to everybody about the evils of the previous Department of Health. You know, and you don't think of politics being played out that way in the health department. Then it turned out that, so we began negotiating a settlement. It also turned out, this is happening because 2001, 9/11 happened 2 years after the spraying. And so there's a whole lead up into 2001, which is relevant. And so after 2001, the spraying was done in New York City by the Office of Emergency Management, not the Department of Health. Office of Emergency Management was headed by a guy named Jerome Hauer, and it was situated in World Trade Center number 7, which was Giuliani's bunker, if you remember back then. Nobody was allowed to go in. Nobody was allowed to see anything. It was like secret, although everybody knew it. Inside, what I didn't know at the time was inside World Trade Center 7 was the largest CIA offices in the country outside of Langley, Virginia. Who knew? Who knew what the intersections were? I still don't know a lot of it, but I could guess. And so when the towers collapsed, well, before the towers collapsed, we were able to go in to the bunker in order to present them with a lawsuit because they weren't releasing any information under the Freedom of Information Act. And they were refusing, so we had to go back to court on that. And then we had to go present them with the subpoena and all that. So our lawyer, Joel Kupferman, went in with one of our members, Robert Letterman, who was one of the founding members of the No Spray Coalition. He's an artist. And they went in and Robert looked around, and Robert was, like me, very irreverent, not wanting to listen to authority at all, not even questioning authority. We need to challenge authority. And so when they got back, Joel gets a call on his phone from the Office of Emergency Management personnel who were livid because they found all these stickers pasted underneath the seats and all over the desks, the garbage that Robert Letterman had. I shouldn't even say that probably, but I guess Robert doesn't live in New York City anymore. And he just pasted these stickers all over, and they were threatening Joel's license. And, you know, over a little thing, you never know what little thing is going to trigger other things. And so so Robert Letterman started getting arrested everywhere for his portrayal of Giuliani as Adolf Hitler. He was a painter, and he made these great big paintings that he did over and over again for different protests. And he had a special interest in this because he supported Giuliani. He had voted for him. And he was feeling betrayed, both personally as well as politically. So you never know. So I learned never to write anybody off. It's one thing to write off corporations and the people, not the people, but the companies that are in it for the profit, but for conquest or empire or whatever. But individuals, I believe that individuals can come around, not necessarily through knowledge, but by just that feeling of being lied to, the feeling that everything you've done now is a lie by the people who are putting you down. So the Office of Emergency Management became the paradigm for what later was to become, just 2 years later, Homeland Security. So sweeps right into it. So Homeland Security, all the same people involved, the laws that passed, the Patriot Act, the Homeland Security Act, all were written before 9/11. They were just waiting, and there were a couple of others too, just waiting for the right moment to be enacted, this repressive thing on civil liberties in the United States. And they used the spraying of New York as the model for what they then did all over the country, not only about spraying, obviously, but about everything. Same people, Jerome Howard became part of that. Same people involved, same way of setting it up, everything. So when we learn that, then we think of the spraying as possibly planning for what they were going to do later. Don't know how much they thought of it in advance, but it certainly became that way afterwards. So reading backwards, it looks like this is all part of the plan in a way. They didn't have to spray. I mean, some people thought you needed to spray, but others were doing their own agenda at the same time. So they were parallel. So yeah, so this was going on in New York. And a year later, we signed a consent agreement where we traded money in our negotiating with the city, because again, it was a new administration, and they were willing to do that. They didn't want to pay out the money. That's all they were concerned about from the city budget. And we couldn't get money under, you sue under Clean Water Act, you can't get money for yourself. So we got it to other groups. We wanted little groups all over New York to be able to get whatever money we could get, which wasn't a hell of a lot. It was like $85,000 eventually. But we used that as seed money for all these little groups concerned with water projects. And a couple of years later, that seed money was used to launch the anti-fracking movement, hydrofracking in New York, through these little groups. And it was incredible. So one thing leads to another, and you never know. Who knew that we're going to be fracking? So yeah, so I guess that, so in the settlement, the city, we traded off money, so we didn't ask for as much for political, agreement of some sort, political concessions. And then, so here's the city agreed, it's in writing, although nobody looks at it anymore in the city, that they admit that the stuff doesn't break down in the time period that he said it does, that it does in fact impact animal life, and there were like that the mosquitoes come back stronger after the spraying because it kills off the natural predators of mosquitoes like bats and dragonflies. And a bat, I learned this in the course of it, one bat can eat 1,500 mosquitoes in an hour. Like where? This little bat? But so in Houston, Texas, they were putting bat boxes instead of spraying for the longest time. And they were killing the mosquitoes that way by eating them. And so they traded off all these concessions. They're there in writing as part of our settlement agreement, enshrined in federal law and locked away in some vault somewhere, or the equivalent of the electronic equivalent of it. And every year the city sprays, we raise the issue, we send it to them again. They don't spray as much. They're not spraying by airplane or helicopter. They definitely don't spray as much. I mean, the first 2 years people were sitting out in Queens eating in restaurants, and they were getting drenched in spray. And organic food markets, their merchandise was just being sprayed. And it just wrecked all sorts of things around the city. Not only people being poisoned. There was a fellow who works at WBAI Radio, where I used to be the chair of the board there. And I interviewed, and I put it in the book, who was coming out just a couple of years ago, because the book just came out this year. And he was coming home from work at 2 a.m. out in Queens, got drenched by the spraying, and he couldn't, and he had asthma and had lung issues. And he was trying to run away from the spray, and there was no place to go. And it sounds a little farcical in a way, because you don't think of these things as dangerous, but they come back, if not immediately, they come back over the years and pretty much haunt you physically. And it's one of a number of issues that were assaults, actually, on our bodies and our health, that is not only from spraying, but it's certainly a component of it. And one of the things that angers me personally is that this is never included in things like the Democratic Party's Green New Deal. So then the Green Party's Green New Deal, it included covering nuclear power, pesticides, genetic engineering. In the Democratic Party's one, it's not covered at all. In fact, they go the opposite way. They think 5G in the Green New Deal of the Democratic Party is promoted, saying this is a good thing. It's insane, because they think that will allow poor people, even though it's not about poor people at all, to have access to, or better access to computers, and it has nothing to do with that, but this is how they're selling it. And you just learn how they sell things. It's nuts. So where we are now, we did sign the settlement with the city, and it looks like the other part of that is the Roundup, the glyphosate. In the course of this, we learned that the city was using Roundup in city parks. And how did we learn it? Well, I was out on the street in Coney Island, near where I live, and I watched all these little kids coming out of school. I was supervising these 3 little kids every day after school, and they come out and then they play, in the playground there right next to the school. And right on the sidewalk nearby, there are all these different blue color, or some days it was a yellow color, and all these kids were, wow, this is yellow, this is blue, this is color, let's go play. And they would go right in there and play in this colored area. Well, the color was added to pesticides, to herbicides, for a good reason, so that you know that these are pesticides are spraying there. But little kids don't know that, and I didn't know it until I checked out, what is this? And it turned out that kids would ride their bikes through it, people would ride their wheelchairs through it. It would come right back into their home on the wheels of their bikes, or whatever, the wheelchairs, or the feet, or your shoes. And so people were getting poisoned, and this was affecting little children. And so when we met with the Brooklyn Parks Department head, he was a guy named Julius Spiegel, I think. Spiegel. I have his name in the book, because I do tell this story in the book. And it was an interesting story. He was really interested. He was one of the only people in office who was actually compassionate and interested in this. And I think it was because his parents were Holocaust survivors. And the idea of being gassed, I mean, he knew that the Jews coming in Borough Park were being gassed by the pesticide spraying on Yom Kippur, on the way to shul. It shouldn't happen any time, but where is your brain or your heart? And so so I was telling him this, and he said, well, what can we do? I said, well, one, there shouldn't be any spraying in parks, but immediately what we could do is at least tell the children in the school to make the announcement over the loudspeakers, so that they go home and tell their parents, or give out letters to them to bring home to their parents, to tell them to stay away from the sprayed areas. Just little things like that anyone who had any sense would do. And he was sort of agreeing with it. But then the biologist from the city, whose name I did find again, but I won't say who it is right now, he was going on how, oh no, Roundup is perfectly safe. You could drink it. I remember when he said that, I said, really? Well, let me get you a cup. Prove it. And it was, the whole idea is that it was safe. That was their mantra for forever. And so, but Spiegel agreed with us. And we were going to put into effect this idea of notifying the schools about it. But then his biologist goes, well, what do you propose instead? It's always the thing. You can't just stop doing it. You have to propose some way of getting rid of weeds. Never asking why you want to get rid of weeds. Who cares? What's the big deal? Well, we found out that the reason why is because there are a couple of things here. They wanted to get rid of the weeds because it was the decision to lay off about 80% of the workforce, the Parks Department. Maybe like a number of thousands of people that got laid off over this period of time, 4 or 5 years. and they wanted to replace so as a labor-saving cost, to replace that with the chemicalization, so to use the chemicals instead of the workers. So the workers didn't use the spray, they used to just bushwhack, or whatever you call it, chop out the weeds by hand, created jobs, and good paying jobs, union jobs. And instead they used the chemical spray in order to knock that out. And that was a decision by Giuliani, under Giuliani, and Mayor Bloomberg. So it's not only environmental, it's anti-labor. So Spiegel said, what do you do instead? And we proposed, I had just met somebody at a Beyond Pesticides conference, which is a great group out of Washington, D.C., and who was a shepherd out in Wyoming. And she had large flocks of both sheep and goats that she would take around to different places to weed, to eat the food, the grass and the so-called weeds. And so I said, well, why don't we use goats? I can't imagine it quite in New York, but I thought it would be a trip and a half to have the goats going up and down the streets and the highways and everything, eating it. So they just left. They just forget that. Well, 2 years ago, they began doing that in New York City. They brought these goats into Prospect Park. It was our No Spray Coalition suggestion, finally, and they had them weed a certain area of the park. Weeding meaning eating, having fun. The goats were thrilled, and they ate, and the little kids could play with them or look at them, and it created a whole different feeling, and it was wonderful. So there are always alternatives if you think about them, if we think holistically, if we think eco-sensibly and not just narrow down, how do we get rid of it? Let's kill it. There are other ways of organically dealing with these things. And so where we are now, how's this for a good answer to short answer? Is it an hour? So where we are now is that we're back in court tomorrow, Wednesday, for over glyphosate. And we finally got a hearing before the city council again. There hasn't been one in 10 years. And where it looks like we're going to be getting Roundup banned from New York City parks, which is over 1,000 parks. So that's a sizable, there are things it doesn't cover, and we have a difference of opinion within our movement. It's where it gets complicated again. It always does. So we argue with each other because some people want to just go for this bill and get a foot in the door and get it started. And others, like myself, are critical of it. It doesn't include golf courses. It doesn't include the sidewalks. And that's essential. But they say, no, well, we could go there from here. And we say, no, this is the only shot we're going to get. So it becomes a debate. And I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow morning because people are pretty angry with each other. So, but it is going to get banned in New York City. I'm convinced of that. The bill has 2/3 of the city council signatures. So, yeah.
In chapter 17 of your book, The Fight Against Monsanto's Roundup, what did you mean by genetic engineering, pesticides, and resistance to the new colonialism?
Genetic engineering is used as part of U.S. policy toward other countries, part of the empire, to kick people off their land, put genetically engineered crops onto that land for export, and then send those people who were kicked off the land, which is hundreds of thousands of people we're talking about, into export zones. Or this is part of the International Monetary Fund's structural adjustment program. So after the U.S. went into Somalia, for example, one of the outcomes of that was the planting, the mandated planting by the U.S., who supposedly went in there just for beneficial reasons, even though it was nonsense, to plant genetically engineered cassava all across that region of Africa, which before had no genetically engineered crops at all, and take over, it helps take over not only the land, but the markets, monocrops. It changes the whole character of communities that were reliant and on the former way of growing things. Corn in Mexico is another good example, how it takes over it dispossesses the communities which were built around a certain way of being connected to the land, and just produces things for a market, and it uproots those people. So it not only takes over their land, but it takes the people, and they are uprooted. They come to the United States across the border. You want people to stop coming to the United States from Mexico across the border, stop, destroying their lives in Mexico. And so that's part of it. Henry Kissinger famously said, to give food aid to a country just because they are starving is a pretty weak reason. And I think about that. To give food aid to a country just because they are starving is a pretty weak reason. How immoral, but also how correct about what the U.S. policy is, that he helped design, of course. Give food as a weapon. Use food as a weapon is Henry Kissinger's idea. To use it because, people are desperate for food once they're dispossessed from their land, to do what they need to do to get food. And that includes planting genetically engineered seeds, which they're not allowed to plant the seeds of, even if it was okay. So after the first round of bombing of Iraq, the Bremer had an edict. Bremer was sort of the viceroy of Iraq that was appointed by the U.S. And he had edict number 81, in which it mandated that they have to not allow genetically engineered crops, which were mandated to be used, to be replanted, the seeds to be replanted. So here we have farmers who normally replant the seeds every year, who, it's part of a culture, a way of doing things. You have big festivals around harvest and planting, and now they're not allowed to plant the seeds that they grew from the previous crop, so that Monsanto or whoever owns it can make money from it. And it's not only making money, but it's taking over, serving other purposes too, in terms of empire. And so he mandated this. This was an edict. And this is a typical thing that's in the IMF structural adjustment, which I started talking about before, structural adjustment SAPs, they're called, projects or programs, and that they have to allow genetically engineered crops to be planted and imported. And there are only now seven countries in the entire world that have said no to that. And the two that come to mind right now, or I know all 7 of them, I've listed them, is Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, who banned genetic engineering from Venezuela. Yay, Hugo. And also Vladimir Putin in Russia. I said, what? Who thinks of Putin that way? What do you mean you're banning genetically engineered? You would think that all he does is sends people to mess up U.S. elections, right? Well, whatever one thinks of that, and I don't believe that that's true anyway, but that's too much of a simplification. They banned genetically. I had people, so in the book, I had my friends who speak fluent Russian go back through the Russian newspapers, because I wanted to know if this is true or not. I didn't want to be just propagandized and then it's not true. And we went through the original Russian newspapers, and just like 3 or 4 years, it's recent. And they did. The Russian parliament, the equivalent, the Diet and whatever else. It's interesting, it's called the Diet when we're talking about food. But, they banned the planting of genetically engineered crops, and are promoting organic in huge areas. And, why? Do they really think it's healthier? I don't know. Maybe they want to compete with the U.S. market in Europe or somewhere else which doesn't want the U.S. In Europe they were rejecting U.S. crops, especially soy and corn, because it's genetically engineered and saturated with spray. And if they have a built-in market then elsewhere, so they have an export crop that they could use to take over. Where they have a huge supplier of wheat and in Russia. So that's part of what I meant by that. Needs to be, try to put it into a larger context to understand why it is that all these leaders around the world know about the dangers of Roundup. They know it. They've known it for years. We've protested for years. There was millions against Monsanto marches every year, and yet they still continue it. It's like continuing the spraying in New York, even though they know it. Why are they continuing? So part of the reason why is because they're leaned on as part of the IMF and US policy that if you want to get grants from the IMF, you have to allow crops, genetically engineered crops, to be planted there or imported. And so all of the US aid that goes to foreign countries, and the earthquake in Puerto Rico or the tsunami in the South Pacific, all of that aid was genetically engineered grains and crops. And when we pointed this out to people in Africa, in Zambia, is it Zambia or I'm not sure which country, Gambia or Zambia. I'm mixing them up right now, sorry. But they were in Seattle. The delegation was in Seattle in 1999, as was I, as was most of the people involved in the anti-genetic engineering movement. And this is for the World Trade Organization, which turned into well-known protests, tear gas, arrests. It was quite a scene. And we met consistently with the people from Africa. Michael Hansen of Consumer Reports, Consumer Union, met with them, and I did. And not only, I played a minor role there, but a lot of people met together. And they didn't know, because it was fairly new at that time, about the dangers of this technology. Even in Cuba in 1992, which is a long time, I had this huge argument. I was there visiting for the first time and had this huge argument at a biotech conference in Cuba with these scientists and my translators were going crazy, like trying to deal with the yelling. But they just didn't know. They never heard this stuff before. And because it was kept from them, because it was Monsanto, and they kept everything secret.
In chapter 11 of your book, The Fight Against Monsanto's Roundup, what did you mean by why I stopped using pesticide poisons?
That was Steve Tweeden's. He was a pesticide applicator in Michigan, and for years he used pesticides, and then his family was getting sick, and some had died. He just died last year, so the book is dedicated part to him as one person, as well as to other people. And he became a hero of the anti-pesticides movement because he began putting his knowledge to use to put online how you could get rid of so-called pests organically without killing them or just by driving them off. Or if you are going to kill them, which I disagree with him on, ways of doing it that doesn't poison you. And but that's what he meant. He put his book online so that anybody could access it for free. And it's The Best Control, Steve Tweeden. And he testified with us also before the city council on what we were going through in New York City. It was quite great. He was there trying to testify when they said, no, we're not taking any testimony. And I stood up and said, what do you mean we're not taking any testimony? This is a city council hearing, you have to. And I just kept persisting. It was almost nobody there, just like 5 people. Let us testify, get it on the record. And so they sort of escorted me out out of the city council chamber. And it turned out to be the city council who ordered it was not only Christine Quinn was in charge, who supposedly was a progressive, which she wasn't at all. She was in bed with every real estate developer, and just like de Blasio is. And a fellow who is the city council member from somewhere in Queens who went, Gennaro, who went to Stony Brook, and who knew me at Stony Brook, and I knew him as this right-winger there. But here he was, an environmentalist, supposedly, on the city council. So he was just, it was like old days, getting escorted out under their orders. So anyway, so that's a roundabout, as usual, answer to your question of what did I mean by giving up pesticides. Steve talks in the chapter about each pesticide and his whole story on why he was spraying, how he sprayed, how they came to stop spraying, what happened to him and his family. And he went on. In No Spray Coalition, there were 8 of our, I mean, we're a little group. We're only like a group of friends or people who just met, but just like us talking now. And when we started, and 8 of the people, core people, died in the course of these like 5 years of spraying. Some people had pre-existing illnesses that were exacerbated by the spraying. Others, we don't know technically, but I do know that they were killed by the spraying and so forth. Just cancers or other type of ailments that they had, lung issues, pneumonia. So it was really, when you look back, in fact, as a side story about people who died, there was one fellow who was a spray truck driver who testified before the federal government, I think, in our court case. We were doing hearings with Ackerman, who was a congressperson here, who was doing great hearings. And we have it on video somewhere. And he went back, we videotaped him. He talked about as a young, he's like 22 or so, and he was already getting bald. He was having issues having sex because of the spraying, we believed, and we turned out to be right as people got tested by Mount Sinai. We brought all the spray truck drivers down to Mount Sinai, and they tested them, and they have a pesticide poisoning diagnosis. It was like, wow, whoever thinks of that. And he ended up, right after testifying, which makes us very suspicious, being found shot dead in the elevator of his building with a couple of bullet holes in him, his wallet still in his pocket. Nothing said. They said he was involved in some illegal thing. Possible he was, but usually they would take your wallet if that's the case. So we don't know if it was retribution or teaching a lesson. Now some of the other spray truck drivers are in the hospital today. I just spoke to a lawyer, Joel Kupperman, and he told me that one of them, the main ones, was again in the hospital. And these are just poor people who were recruited originally to spray, who didn't know anything. They came out of the projects like I did, like originally, and like a lot of people did, and who needed a job. And so they sprayed, and they spent the whole time a lot of the time in their trucks at the end of their shift spraying. They had to let go or release all that was left over in their spray trucks. So they just sat there and sprayed it into the air wherever they were parked. They didn't even think twice. There was no training. They had no uniforms, no protective gear, no gas masks, nothing. And this is just treating these people like dirt. And so there are many dimensions to this anti-pesticide struggle, and that we don't think of. We only think in terms of our own individual health. I mean, I don't mean to overstate it, but the movement as a whole has raised, or the mainstream groups have raised it only narrowly in terms of, the spray itself and trying to chemically prove this or chemically prove that, when in reality it goes much deeper than that. It has to do with poverty. It has to do with who gets to do the spraying, why aren't they unionized? What happens to the police officers who were following the spray trucks and who never were instructed that they were sucking it into their cars through their systems while the spray truck is going? Now, we did meet with the police union, and they were most helpful. They told us about a thing called the Bio Chemical Handbook that every police officer got at one point from the mayor's office. And in it, it said, again, Robert Letterman was one of the people who got this, and it said that keep your windows shut. Although who knew that the spraying was toxic? So here they are in the handbook saying that it's toxic, but in reality, they're saying it's not toxic. Mayor Giuliani said, again, you could just drink this, like the other one. You could just drink it. And we all, yes, drink it, drink it, drink it. And he said, and these people are just alarmists and terrorist supporters. They want to be on, because that's when they were saying Saddam Hussein was doing the spraying.
In Chapter 9 of your book, The Fight Against Monsanto's Roundup, what did you mean by which side are you on?
Well, that was sort of a pun on pesticide. Whose side are you on? You know, the side of the people or the side of the drug companies, the pesticide manufacturers, the DuPonts and Dow and Monsantos and Syngenta and ChemChina, and just aren't that many of them. There are only like a few, and they're now they're consolidating, and they're controlling the world's seeds. So we have Bayer buying Monsanto for $66 billion a couple of years ago. We had Syngenta merging with ChemChina. We have Dow and DuPont merging into something called Corteva. Who knew about that? All within the same few years, just the last like 4 or 5 years. And they now control, between them and maybe one other major company, BASF, they're controlling about 80% of the world's seeds, almost all of which is genetically engineered. Can't be replanted. You have to buy them anew each year from the companies that manufacture them under penalty of who knows what. Monsanto has their own police force that's allowed to come onto your land to check for what seed, whether you're using their genetically engineered seeds or not, illegally, supposedly. When the spray drifts onto your land, like the case of Percy Schmeiser in Canada, where he was a canola farmer and had this huge field in Western Canada. And it's like a famous case that went all the way up to the Canadian Supreme Court. He didn't want genetically engineered or pesticides on his land. He was just planting canola, which itself is problematic because it's not a real, I mean, it is a real plant, but according to Percy, when I spoke with him, he said he would never eat it, canola oil, even though we were told that it was healthy for you. But anyway, so the spray went onto his land and polluted his existing, it drifted. It wasn't the spray that drifted, it was the genetic component, parts of the plant that carried over and crossbreeded with the existing plants. And Monsanto came onto his land, had him arrested for stealing their property, as if he wanted it. He had no idea. So he felt that this was a way that he could fight, though. He was an interesting person, and he wanted to fight that he wasn't stealing their property. They were trespassing on his land. And this became a huge issue in the court. The court eventually ruled in Monsanto's favor, but only fined Percy like $1 or something as a token. It's still horrible because he should have won that. And similar things are happening here now, where Monsanto has their own police force that could come onto your land. So when we think of Monsanto now being owned by Bayer, which is the world's largest manufacturer of neonicotinoids, which is killing bees all over the world. So we think, Bayer, how bad could Bayer be? A friendly aspirin company. They make aspirin. They get rid of headaches. Well, they worked with the Nazis in World War II. They helped provide the gas for the gas chambers in World War II, before World War II. In fact, all the pesticides used today have origins in World War II as nerve gases that were used by the Nazis and also by the British, and also to a lesser extent at that time by the US. So it's all there.
Should everyone have a nicely manicured green grass lawn? What's wrong with it? And did people always have these lawns?
To me, that's wild, because I remember my cousin's lawn we used to visit in Plainview, Long Island. And we were city kids, so we never had lawns. Growing up in the projects and coming out of there. And so it was like great. We got to play on his lawn. And he's always, no, stay off my lawn. I want to keep it green and lush like this. And good thing we stayed off of it, because he used Scott's turf builder or whatever it was called back then. And poison kills dandelions. I mean, who cares if there are dandelions growing in a lawn? That's pretty. Yellow dandelions. Dandelion tea is great for your liver. What are they thinking? But it became a suburban part of moving to suburbia. It became part and parcel of what that meant. Having a lawn is reinforced by the local districts, that you can't have other things on your lawn. You can't. When I rented a house later in Port Jeff Station, Long Island, and we just dug up the lawn and we planted crops. And all hell broke loose. We thought it was the greatest thing in the world. Wow, we never did this before. We're, again, city boys. Now we're being farmers, and this is fun. And neighbors didn't like it. The landlord definitely didn't like it. Fought to evict us, eventually succeeded. So what's a lawn? So there's some quotes in the book from New York Times article and others about what is a lawn? What is the history of the lawn? And that's all, it's interesting, because we take for granted that this is how something should look. Why? Because it was like that in playing polo, is where it's from, in England, under the king in the Middle Ages. They had these lawns that took a lot to keep neat and manicured so that they could play polo on it. And that's where this comes from. And here we are copying that as our model, reducing it in size, of course, and seeing it as something that's good or healthy. Why? So we have to, the purpose of the book is to rethink some of the things that we take for granted and we never think to question. Who would ever question a lawn? Yeah, of course. You have a lawn, you have a picket fence, you have a 2-car garage, you have two kids in your family, and you're set to go. Well, no, it's nuts.
In chapter 13 of your book, The Fight Against Monsanto's Roundup, what did you mean by consequences of glyphosate effects on animal cells, animals, and ecosystems?
It's not only glyphosate, it's Roundup. What's turning out now is that Roundup, which was the tests by Monsanto, were only on glyphosate. Didn't know, or they didn't report the other components, which are POEAs, which are surfactants that helps penetrate into the plant further and also into people, doing different biological pathways. And it also has, lo and behold, arsenic. And who knew that? We just found that out a year ago by the Seralini studies in France. Why didn't the EPA and FDA know this before they approved it? Didn't they test it? No. The way it works in the US is no precautionary principle, which there should be, which means that before you could put a chemical on the market and use, you have to prove that it's safe. Doesn't exist here. that's part of the problem. So part of it has to do with your question with the biological pathways that glyphosate is able to penetrate, but also it's the other parts of Roundup as well. And all of the same chapter, chapter 13, Robin Falk Esser wrote that, who's a PhD in biology and biophysics, and it's the person who just left. And she wrote that about Monsanto's so-called science that they use to justify using why it's safe. And we went on tour in California talking about it, and she just tore apart the science of it. It's phony science. It's not real. And she went piece by piece through why the excuses and rationalizations that Monsanto is using are just totally garbage. And so I asked, I'm not a scientist. I could read it, but I can't reproduce what she says in that chapter off the top of my head, because that's not my field. But I certainly can read it, and so could you in the book. It's chapter 13, yeah. So it's quite interesting the way the lies work. And then Stacy Malkin did a whole piece in there also in the book about how the lies work, how they Robin tore it apart, how they work scientifically and why they don't work and what's wrong with them. And Stacy Malkin looked at the way they're used in the world around us to promote Monsanto's products and to diffuse opposition to it and to try and control the opposition, including lying, not only overt lying, but getting their own scientists, suppressing their own scientists' complaints about what they were doing. One scientist, who's no hero at all, she didn't have the guts to come forward really, but she was dragged into court through a memo that was found through the recent trials that are happening, and found that she had actually complained to Monsanto and said, we can't say that it's not a carcinogen because we didn't do the testing on the full product. We only tested the glyphosate, and even that's a problem. But we didn't test it with the arsenic and the POEAs and everything else. So it's quite amazing that they're allowed to get away with this without anybody complaining, except we're complaining, but with governments just allowing it to happen.
Can you summarize in 15 seconds everything we talked about today?
Probably not. Probably not, because it's not only about, will it kill me? Yes, it will. Will it? But it's also about, what do we do? What do we as a movement do to stop it? Do we fight? Are we condemned to fighting one pesticide at a time? So we ban DDT, and then we get organophosphates. We ban organophosphates. We got banned arsenic before that. We banned whatever's coming up next. We may be on the verge of banning glyphosate, and they already have dicamba out there. So when we're on this pesticide treadmill, and that we have to not only get off the treadmill, but bust up the gears of that treadmill so that it's just collapses and that we no longer have to face this situation. And that's what the book is about, actually, how to do that, why to do that, and ways in which people are doing that around the world. So I'm very excited, especially people in Africa and Latin America are leading the way on this. We don't normally think about that here in the United States, but they're on the front edge of this way more than even the United States, which is pesticided and Roundup-ready corn and soy are everywhere. But in other countries, people are being dispossessed from their lands. They're being poisoned. Their water supplies are being poisoned. And this is something that we have to care about. We can't only care about ourselves. Yes, we need to care about ourselves. We have to care about other people and the uses to which our so-called science is being used in the interest of empire. And we have to smash the empire.
Why did you feel it was important to come speak here at the Real Truth About Health conference?
Well, this is exciting. I didn't know about this conference at all. Steve Shore invited me, and I was looking up and I saw that Vandana Shiva spoke in the past, and that we toured with Vandana Shiva earlier this year. So going up through Vermont and New England and talking at different places. And that was a big selling point of the conference, that we heard some of the people who had been here. I was really worried that I didn't know what it was, and all these people got hung up going to speak at conferences that later turned out to be sponsored by some arch right-wing group or the Ku Klux Klan, or so I was worried about that. And then I talked to Steve, and he assured me that that wasn't what this was about at all, which was good to know. And I worried because on Long Island, I know this is not originating on Long Island, but I didn't know that at the time, but Ronkonkoma and Yaphank years ago used to be the headquarters of the the Nazis actually in the U.S., and also the Ku Klux Klan on Long Island. Nobody knows. I was in jail out in Yaphank and Riverhead, and that history was still evident even when I was in jail there. But it used to be, the actual headquarters, the physical headquarters with the big swastika flag flying on it in Yaphank. So I was worried about that. But when I came here and I saw that this is, no, I'm just being a paranoid nut, and then, so I checked it out further, and people were so generous, and it's such a great conference. Our panel last night was the best panel I was on it, but the other speakers, I was fascinated by what everybody was talking about. It was just great. So I appreciated the opportunity. And it's just, it's great meeting people. Free food also. It's like the food has been excellent, just excellent. I think it needs more greens, but it's still excellent. And so I much thank everybody for it. I'm feeling very grateful for the opportunities that have opened up to me here and also in general in my life. Steve introduced me as someone who struggled, who sacrificed so much to be this, that. It was very generous, but I don't feel that way. I feel it's joyful. I feel it's an opportunity to fight back. I don't know, maybe it's the way I was brought up. To hell with them, hell with the bastards. Let's organize and take them down, and that's fun.
If somebody wants to learn more about your work, where should they go?
They could go to a couple of places. One is www.nospray.org. That's for the No Spray Coalition work. And a lot of links between. Or you could go to the book. The website for the book is called The Politics of Pesticides.com. www.thepoliticsofpesticides.com. And that's a good place to learn more about it as well. And, I also am a poet, and I write poetry. I sell my poetry on the streets. I have several books out and about 10,000 pamphlets on various topics. So you could go to my website to find more about that, which is my name, Mitchel Cohen, www.mitchelcohen, one L in Mitchell, .com. And you can find out more about all sorts of things there. Thank you all.